Greetings from World Report on Ukrainian soil, the most amazing Game of Thrones of the century is currently airing, with the fight between the opposing groups of the conflict. A new era in the tired pages of world history begin. This explains how the Ukrainian army, both in the Donbass and along the southern front lines that reached the Crimea, drew the Russians into a march in order to liberate the Crimea and cut off Putin's soldiers from the borders of Belarus and Russia. As well as the Donbass region, Kiev is waging a simultaneous offensive campaign in particular in Zaporizhia, Verdiansk, Melitopol, Crimea, and the Russian cities around this peninsula. We have been seeing the aggressive operations of the Ukrainian army over the past few weeks. What is the most recent situation on the eastern front lines of Ukraine? Recently, the Ukrainians have scaled back their ground assault efforts on the southern front lines. Moscow interpreted the battle strategy of the Ukrainian armed forces as a pause. Russian officials are currently criticizing the Ukrainian advance on the southern front lines as being insufficient when the Ukrainian army stops in the trenches of the battlefield. Russian government spokesmen usually portray Kiev's situation as poor, but the massive activity on the eastern front lines led us to conclude that this was Kiev's fresh offensive strategy. Even the Russians were unprepared for the sudden and aggressive offensive operations that the Ukrainian army recently launched near to Bakhmut. The Russians started to fill in the gaps in these front lines after the Wagner forces withdrew from Bakhmut and its environs. The Russian military dispatched soldiers to the area. Nevertheless, more than 100,000 Russian soldiers who were on their way to Bakhmut ended up in the hands of the Ukrainian armed forces because Ukraine controls both Bakhmut and the supply routes that go to the city. After Wagner troops left Donbass in Bakhmut and the surrounding area, the 1st Army, 2nd Army and pro-Russian Chechen special forces are at work. There are around 42,000 men in the Russian 1st Army and 46,000 in the Russian 2nd Army. There are also possibly 15,000 pro-Russian Chechen fighters in the region, along with the 1st Tank Army of the Russian Army and other support forces. The Russian 1st and 2nd Armies, constituted for the Luhansk and Donetsk areas, have felt the power of Ukraine for months following the astonishing attack by the Ukrainian forces in both the Luhansk and Donetsk two regions. As a result of the operational siege, 100,000 Russian forces are stranded in the center of Chechnya. The 72nd Motor Brigade of the Russian army, stationed close to Klykha south of Bakhmut, was one of the units that submitted to the Ukrainians, according to the Deputy Minister of Defense of Ukraine. On a Malyar, the last of the Ukrainian forces marched 1,200 meters towards Klishevka and 1,500 meters towards Kurdyamivka south of Bakhmut. Malyar noted that the western border of Bakhmut still in the control of Ukrainian forces. However, the most bloody clashes lately have been in and around the city. As a result, when the Ukrainian army finally took possession of Klishche, thousands of Russian men were unable to pass through it and reach Bakhmut. According to Colonel Sy Sheravati, spokesman for the Eastern Army of Ukraine, when the Russians failed to deliver troops from Klishchevka to Bakhmut, the Moscow administration attempted to send reinforcements to the citadel of the war from a different front line, declared the transfer of a regiment of the Russian Air Force from Bakhmut to Lefman. However, it is claimed that Ukrainian forces struck these units severely. The Ukrainians had shut almost every entrance and exit in Bakhmut, as observed the struggle from behind closed doors. Putin began to realize that he had lost when the gates of hell are closed. We will have to take into account the Russian soldiers who stayed in Bakhmut, because 50,000 Russian soldiers are reportedly fighting in the city of Bakhmut right now. If we include the Russian reinforcements attempting to approach the city from the vicinity of Bakhmut, it is clear that a total of 100,000 Russian soldiers are subject to the blockade of Ukraine. Russian troops attempting to enter Bakhmut kept receiving news from the front lines in the city's north, despite Ukrainian attempts to completely shut Off the transportation to the city, the Russians continued in utilizing their soldiers to carry them to Bakhmut. The 106th Air Assault Division of Russia, which was located close to Berkivka, was one of the units making their way into the fortress of the battle. The 106th Air Assault Division's troops had to travel on a journey Kiev termed the Death Voyage, which was very risky. Subscribe to News Expressway for the latest news and updates.